Today I'm going to save you time and I'm going to save you money. If you're looking to buy a 7900 XTX, XT or RTX 4080 and you're just confused because there's so many reviews out right now and you don't have the time or you don't really have the energy or interest in going through all of them to get a proper conclusion on which is actually the better GPU to buy, AMD or Nvidia, I'm actually going to do something called a meta-analysis today. Basically, I'm going to sum up my 5 top reviews and basically give you the overarching conclusion, overarching trends, and overarching average results of all these 5 reviews with its multiple benchmarks so that you can get a simplified, distilled answer on which is going to be the best GPU for you. And if you're part of the majority of my audience based in Singapore, make sure you keep watching the whole video because there will be information about Singapore pricing, Singapore deals littered throughout the video as well, because it will not just be great for international audiences, it's also going to be great for Singaporean audiences. So what is a meta-analysis? A meta-analysis is when a research study is about other research studies. Rather than going out and getting my own data, I'm going to be reviewing other reviews. Before you come at me and say, oh, you're just leeching off people, what I'm actually doing is I'm using the power of hindsight and the power of the large data sets that is enabled by using other people's data sets to basically see if there's really any true overarching truths or overarching trends that will allow you to make better purchase decisions. I'm not claiming to be better than Linus by doing a meta-analysis of Linus and other reviewers. I'm actually just trying to add something on top of that to see with hindsight if there is a overarching trend among all of these reviews and to see if any reviews did get it wrong. Spoiler alert, they didn't. All their trends are very consistent with very minimal fluctuations. And because I'm corroborating 5 different reviews worth of information and data into a single kind of formula, I'm able to actually have reasonable confidence in what my numbers actually mean and whether my conclusions actually mean anything, because the data set is so much bigger than any other review out there since it's built on multiple numbers of reviews. So I chose my 5 favorite reviewers, but I can actually include more in the future if this idea is well received, this meta-analysis and meta-review concept. But I chose LINUSTECHTIPS, Gamers Nexus, Jay's 2 Cents, Hardware Canucks, and AnandTech. So let's start off with non-retracing 4K performance. So with non-retracing 4K performance, the lead is very clearly in AMD's side, and across 17 games from 5 different reviewers, the average results seem to indicate a whopping 6.5% performance advantage for non-ray-traced 4K gaming for the 7900 XTX over the RTX 4080. What's curious though is that the lead the 4080 has over the smaller brother, the 7900 XT, is also 6.5%. But the thing is, using Singaporean pricing, so the XT is going to be 1499 in Singapore, the XTX is going to be 1699 in Singapore, and the 4080 is going to be about 2.1k in Singapore. Using these numbers, it seems to indicate that the XTX and XT have about an equal amount of value for money advantage over the 4080. So both the XTX and the XT seem to be about 31.6 or 31% respectively more value for money than the RTX 4080 based on Singapore pricing in non-ray tracing 4K game. But if we use international US currency pricing, the international MSRP, AMD quotes, and Nvidia quotes for the cards, we do find that this advantage in value for money that happens for AMD is slightly less. So the XTX only has about a 28% advantage in terms of value for money over the RTX 4080, whereas the 7900 XT has a smaller advantage at about 25% over the RTX 4080. Still pretty sizable margins, and if you don't care about ray tracing, this is reason enough to get AMD instead of Nvidia. But how about ray traced 4K performance? What is the value like there, and what is the average performance difference there? And this is where it gets complicated, but let's do the standard numbers first. Now, across 7 games with ray traced max out settings, it seems that the 4080 is about 11.5% ahead of the RX 7900 XTX, whereas the 4080 is about 23% ahead of the performance of the 7900 XT when it comes to 4K ray traced performance. There are a couple of things that I would say are quite interesting here. So if you're talking about ray tracing performance, the value for money of the XTX and the XT drops to 9.5% and 8% on Singapore pricing, which is substantially worse than the 31% I talked about earlier with non-ray traced performance. But when it comes down to American pricing, international USD MSRP, it gets really bad. The 7900 XTX only has a 6.4% advantage over the 4080 when it comes to value for money, with ray tracing performance. And when it comes to value for money in ray tracing performance for the 7900 XT, it's basically been whittled down to a measly 3%. So essentially, averaged out, the value for money argument for AMD is significantly lost in the American markets when we talk about 4K ray tracing performance, which is going to be important to some people. Obviously, to some people, this is actually not a very crucial thing. They think the performance hit is too much to justify the increase in visual quality, which to some, they might consider that too minimal to matter. So it really depends on how much you value ray tracing. If you value it a lot, then this is looking like a very 4080 or XTX biased conversation. But if you are just kind of okay or not very interested about ray tracing performance, well, the value is still in AMD's side firmly. But the problem with these numbers is they don't actually really reflect the real issue with the 7900 XTX and 7900 XT's ray tracing performance. It's not the flat numbers that is the problem, it's the inconsistency of the numbers. So what I noticed across a bunch of reviews was that in some games, the 7900 XTX and XT would actually beat, match, or just plain keep up with the RTX 4080. In some games, the XT even beats the 4080 in ray tracing, but in some games, the titles that are clearly better optimized for NVIDIA than they are for AMD, the 7900 XTX and XT fall so far behind, they fall to the performance levels of last-gen cards like the 6950 XT and the 3090 Ti. This inconsistency has actually resulted in some false conclusions by Linus. So Linus reviewed the 7900 XTX and XT's ray tracing performance using Shadow the Tomb Raider and Cyberpunk, which from the benchmarks clearly indicate that they have been poorly optimized for AMD's ray tracing performance. He then went on to conclude that the 4080 was conclusively ahead of AMD's 7900 XT and XTX in ray tracing. When in reality, there are many games like F1 2022, Forza Horizon, Modern Warfare, and Far Cry 6 where AMD and NVIDIA actually trade blows in ray tracing. And this inconsistency is very hard to explain and very hard to predict, and is going to result in some false conclusions when it comes to ray tracing performance. And I think if you are buying either of these three GPUs based on ray tracing performance, I would actually say go and look at individual benchmarks of the games that you want to play before deciding which is better. Because for some games, it's so well optimized for AMD that hands down AMD will win in value every time. In some games, it's just so poorly optimized for AMD that the price difference to the 4080 is actually worth it. And that makes my job as a reviewer really hard to explain which exactly you should get. So my simplified advice for people who care a lot about ray tracing is decide what games you're going to play the most that have ray tracing, that you care about ray tracing on. Look at the benchmarks for those games, for these GPUs individually, and then decide from there. If those games happen to be well optimized for AMD, I'm quite confident that most of the time AMD is going to win that value argument because it's so aggressively priced. If those games are not well optimized for AMD, the performance difference then in those cases is on average close to 20-30% between the XTX and 4080, which is frankly enough to justify the price jump to the RTX 4080 for ray tracing. But that's only if you prioritize ray tracing and the games that you want to play and are planning to play the most are very, very well optimized for NVIDIA but not well optimized for AMD. So in that tiny niche situation, do I recommend the 4080? Almost everywhere else, the AMD just looks like a way better deal. How about other types of benchmarks, like productivity? Now this one is another case-by-case situations like ray tracing where it's a bit complicated. If you are talking about video editing in DaVinci Resolve or Premiere Pro, it just seems like the XT and XTX are just straight up value winners. If you're talking about streaming, the AV1 encoder in the 900 XTX is more than enough to keep up with NVENC, especially with H.264 and H.265 waning from dominance, and it's not really a deal breaker anymore. I will also say DLSS is no longer really a deal breaker for NVIDIA because FSR has gotten really quite good, and it seems to be able to keep up with DLSS. It might generally be a few months behind DLSS in terms of quality and performance. I would definitely wait a few months for an updated FSR over paying extra just because I want DLSS. It's not worth the extra cost it costs to get to a NVIDIA card. Not at this point at least. Plus the fact that AMD has had a much better track record of supporting new features on their old graphics card, whereas I can't be that sure about DLSS 4, DLSS 5, or DLSS 6 being supported on these 4000 series GPUs because NVIDIA doesn't have a good track record of backwards compatibility. Then there's also another pro and con that you have to consider that many reviewers have talked about, and that is the size. So the 7900 XTX and XT are just substantially smaller than the RTX 4080s. And now these are the reference boards, and the third-party coolers are going to be quite a bit bigger. Some of them are actually going to be 4080 size. At least with this AMD cards, you have an option of a small size GPU. With the 4080s and 4090s, even the smallest cards are quite big. Either that or you have to go for water cooling, which is bulky in its own different way, even if the actual card's footprint is a bit smaller. So then, in conclusion, which one should you actually get? The 7900 XTX, XT, or RTX 4080? I think if you're an American buyer, whatever hardware Canucks and Gamers Nexus and Hardware Unbox has said is true. The XT doesn't seem that great of value, and it's just a better idea to get the XTX. But if you're a Singaporean buyer, I would actually say both the XT and XTX are equal in terms of value for money. And both are just great alternatives to the RTX 4080 that are substantially cheaper. They both provide about the same amount of value. They just have different level of performance and different level of price to match that performance rather accurately. So if your budget's smaller, get the XT. Or if you don't need the XTX level of performance, get the XT. You're not really missing out on value for money by going with the XT if you're in Singapore. And as for the 4080, until there is a big price drop, I find it hard to recommend unless the specific games that you are playing are very, very NVIDIA biased in terms of their optimization, and you can only really get a good experience on 4K ray tracing with a 4080. Apart from that niche situation, or if your work software for professional work or for your career needs NVIDIA, I would say that apart from those two niche situations, this is quite a conclusive win for AMD, both in US and in Singapore. And with that, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you appreciate this video. Make sure you like and subscribe. I've shot this video for 6 hours now. It's